All right, so today the Bearded Wonder is going to explain a new kind of slavery. If you remember, last video that we had last week covered slavery, the issue of slavery in America, kind of the economic side of slavery. Remember that that's definitely not the only side of slavery, but it is important to understand. But today I want to talk about a different kind of slavery. So normally when we think about slavery, we're thinking about this kind of slavery. We're thinking about people being forced to work in fields and owned by a master. Normally in our American experience, this is based on race, or at least partially based on race. However, slavery technically by the definition doesn't necessarily have anything to do with race. And that's what we call chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is a legal system where a human is treated as a legal property of another. In other words, people are property. Chattel literally carries with it this idea of property that can be transferred from one person to another. It can be sold. And so chattel slavery is treating a person literally like a tractor or a couch. And that's obviously problematic from a moral standpoint. But there are other kinds of slavery. The people that started our country and the British philosophers of the 1600s talked about slavishness, which was a state of mind. In other words, you were not free. You were a slave, not in the sense that somebody owns you, but a slave as far as a slave, you're ruled by your own passions rather than by reason. That would be slavishness. And they got this idea from the Greeks. Aristotle and other people like that kind of describe this idea of slavishness. And then the third one is this issue of dependency, which is not having the resources necessary to be financially or politically independent. This is why they didn't want certain people who didn't have property to vote. Mainly because they were dependent upon another group of people and they didn't feel like their vote really represented themselves. So the 13th Amendment ends chattel slavery in America. And that's kind of where we're going to start today. We're talking about Reconstruction and a new kind of slavery. And Thomas Jefferson, even in the 1820s, was worried that if we ended chattel slavery, that we would take a lot of those enslaved people and just kind of leave them still in these conditions of slavishness or dependency. That if they didn't have any skills, they would still be dependent. And maybe if they didn't have moral development, that they would still be slavish in their characteristics. And so he was concerned about that. And one of the main reasons why a lot of people like Jefferson who opposed slavery continued to support it in the short term was because they were trying to solve these issues of slavishness and dependency. So, during Reconstruction, we have four groups of people, and I want us to be thinking about this idea of dependency. Did that form of slavery end with the Civil War and the 13th Amendment? So the first group of people were carpetbaggers. They were Northerners. They came to the South from the North to get rich. Their goal was basically, hey, we're going to move here. We're going to start a bunch of factories like we have in the North, and since I'm going to start it, I'm going to be the owner. That's going to make me rich. That's kind of their goal. We have the plantation owners. They were former Confederates. A lot of them continued to have their land. This is going to be one of the issues of Reconstruction. Do we take their land away from them? After all, they did rebel against the United States government, and there are people like the Freedmen who need land. That would be a solution if we just give some of the land from the plantation owners to the freedmen. Now they have land, and that gets us closer or further, I guess, away from dependency. And then we also have the poor white Southerners, who were also former Confederates. They didn't own slaves before, but they were land poor. They didn't have a lot. But if we're taking away land from all former Confederates, we're going to take land away from them too. And now the question is, are we just trading one kind of slavery for another? So during Reconstruction, two groups of people had political power, and we're going to talk about here in a second a third one. But the carpetbaggers, the Northerners, had political power. They had the right to vote, and so did the Freedmen. If you were a former Confederate in, say, South Carolina, for example, you literally were not allowed to vote during Reconstruction. And so we have a situation where most of the people living in South Carolina actually can't vote because they supported the Confederacy during the war between the states. The last group that had political power, and actually more than the carpetbaggers or the freedmen, are Northerners. Since they had conquered the South, literally on a battlefield, they got to pick, and they were picking who voted, and in many cases, their support for certain people was kind of determining the political processes and power in the South. And so we have radical Republicans and Democrats that were doing that. The other issue that we have is economic power. Who has land? Because we've talked a lot about land, especially in the South where you grow crops, you need land to grow them on, and that means whoever has land has economic power. Well, so far, it's really the plantation owners. The plantation owners hold all of the land. And the question is, what do we do with them? Well, the Northerners basically decide that they're not going to get involved with land. In other words, they're going to kind of tap out, which means that they're also eventually going to tap out of this political situation. They're basically, as long as they can get the southern states to come back into the Union and to accept the 13th Amendment that slavery is done, they kind of feel like they've done their good deed, and that's all they needed to do. And so eventually the plantation owners and the poor white Southerners get the right to vote back. Which means now everybody has political power in the system. But only one group, the plantation owners, has economic power because they still own all the land. Eventually, these three groups all kind of get rid of the carpetbaggers, the Northerners. The freedmen don't really like them. The carpetbaggers kind of came down, tried to force them to go to school. To work in a factory, you need to be able to read the instruction manual. And so they tried to force all of the people, adults as well, to go to school. And the problem is that the school didn't help the freedmen with their immediate economic needs. So it might be great to get an education. That might be the key to your future. But I kind of have to survive today to get to my future. And how am I going to feed my family? And so they didn't like the carpetbaggers. Plantation owners didn't like them either, mainly because they wanted to change the economic model. And if the plantation owners continue to own the land, why would you want anything to change? And the poor white Southerners really didn't want anything to change either, mainly because they just resented the fact that somebody was coming and trying to tell them how to live their life. They also were pretty ticked off about the whole Civil War thing and just didn't like Northerners, period. And so all of this leads to a situation where the carpetbaggers are gone. And so this kind of puts, eventually, after a while, the poor white Southerners and the freedmen lose political power as well. And so now the economic power and the political power rest in the plantation owners. They have a problem, though. They have a lot of land, but land by itself isn't valuable. You got to do something with it. And the people that want it can't really afford to buy it from you. So what do you do? What kind of situation do we work out here? And the answer is what we call a sharecropping system. Basically, if we think about the poor white Southerners and the freedmen now as one group called sharecroppers. They don't have land, they don't have education. What they can do is work. And so basically what they do is they trade their work to the plantation owner, and they don't trade the work straight up. They actually trade a future crop sale for the rights to use the plantation owner's land. Now, this actually ends up making the plantation owners more money. The reason why they earn more money is because the land use is actually higher than it was. And so that's kind of beneficial to them. They can grow more crops on their land than they used to. They're making more money. They're also not paying to keep slaves alive anymore because they're free, and so it's not their obligation. Um, Eventually, what ends up happening is that the sharecroppers go deeper into debt. Let's say that they traded 10% of their crop. 10% ends up, well, I can't do 10%. I can do 7 this year because I got to pay just to pay the bills. And so the plantation owner says, that's fine. You just give me 15% next year. Sharecroppers say that's fine because we need the money now. And so that system, after, if you play that forward 10, 15 years, pretty soon the plantation owners are owning massive portions of the crops that are being grown on their land. The sharecroppers certainly aren't getting any cash or really moving forward economically at all. And so on top of that, we have this competition for the sharecrop contracts. Literally, the poor white farmers and the freedmen are fighting against each other economically, which leads to fighting against each other politically, for the same contract, which gets cheaper labor, better rates for the plantation owners. And so as really weird as it ends up working out, ending slavery ends up being economically beneficial to the people that used to own the slaves through this sharecropping system. And so that's kind of the situation that we end up with. And so the question here that I want to ask, if you look at the definition here of dependency, is this: did Reconstruction just create a different kind of slavery in America? And that's the question I want you to think about. I hope you have a great day.